Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Peter Barnes, and on behalf of my colleague Antony and myself, I would like to invite you to this evening's event, which the British-German Association is organising jointly with the German Historical Institute, London. In a moment, I'll hand over to Dr. Michael Scheich to introduce our distinguished speaker. But just a small bit of housekeeping in advance. Our speaker will be giving a lecture which will last around 40 minutes, and we will then have around 15 to 20 minutes for audience Q&A. If you would like to ask a question, please do so through the chat function at any stage while Professor MacMillan is talking, and we will try to address your question during the Q&A. If you're not already a member of the British-German Association and would like to support our work, please join us, and my colleague will send the link that you can click to become a member. And now, without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Dr. Michael Scheich from the German Historical Institute, London.
Yeah, thank you very much, Peter. As Peter just said, my name is Michael Scheich. I'm the Deputy Director of the German Historical Institute London. I also want to welcome everyone who is joining us online tonight on behalf of the Institute. I'm delighted to be able to co-organize this event with the British-German Association, and I'm only sorry that we can't host the lecture in the beautiful surroundings of our conference room, but I very much hope that next year, when we will have our next joint lecture, we will be able to invite you back to the Institute and to have a real life event again. It gives me particular pleasure to welcome our distinguished guest speaker tonight, Professor Margaret MacMillan. She is without doubt one of the most famous historians in Britain today. Many of you will know her from her frequent appearances on radio and television, in particular her programs on the First World War, and from her articles on contemporary affairs in some of the world's leading newspapers and journals. She has also published many best-selling and prize-winning books on British Imperial history and 19th and 20th century international history. For many years, Margaret MacMillan was Professor of International History at the University of Oxford and also the Warden of St. Antony's College, and she's now Professor of History at the University of Toronto. She has held numerous visiting professorships all over the world, and she's also the recipient of many honors. For example, she's a Companion of the Order of Canada and a Companion of Honor here in the UK. So we are really very fortunate that Professor MacMillan has kindly agreed to talk about total war and European society, a theme which she explores in a much wider historical context in her most recent book, published only a few days ago with Penguin and already temporarily out of stock on Amazon. The title of the book is War, How Conflict Shaped Us, and it is based on the Rees lectures that she gave on the BBC in 2018. As Peter said, there will be time for questions after the lecture, but now I don't want to take up any more of our time, and I hand over to Professor MacMillan. Thank you very much for joining us tonight, Professor MacMillan. It's a great pleasure to have you here in this kind of virtual room space. We are very much looking forward to your lecture. The floor, if there is such a floor in the digital world, is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Scheich, and many thanks to the British-German Association and the German Historical Institute for being so flexible about this lecture. We had, of course, I think all hoped that we would have it in London and we'd be able to meet face to face, and COVID-19 has interrupted that. But I'm so pleased that we've been able to do it this way, and I hope that some of you will feel that you can ask questions. My subject tonight is total war, and I'll start, as one often does, with a definition. And I had thought when I started looking at it that, well, yes, I know what total war is. It's quite easy to understand. And then I realized that there is actually no clear agreement on what it is. Does it really exist at all? And so I've come up with what I hope is a simple and fairly straightforward definition. I think there is something called total war. I think we need to try and distinguish the wars, the great wars of the 20th century, the First and Second World War in particular, from earlier, more limited wars, say in the 18th century and even in parts of the 19th century. So my definition of total war, and please feel free to disagree with me, is that first of all, it involves the mobilization, at least in theory, of every citizen for war. Second thing is that because it is war of society against society, the targets that are aimed at expand. The targets on the other side expand. The enemy is seen as the totality of its society, and that includes its economy, its infrastructure, and of course, its civilians. A third aspect, I think, of total war is that limits which have previously been agreed or perhaps even signed up to internationally are broken. And that means that powers involved in what becomes a total war will use weapons that have been banned. They will treat prisoners in ways that have not been allowed in either norms or international laws. And they will treat civilians as enemies and treat them in ways, again, which have not been allowed previously. And I think a fourth thing is somehow we want the word total to try and explain the sheer scale, the costs, and the destruction of certain types of wars. The term, as far as we know, was first used during the First World War as people struggled to try and comprehend this catastrophe which had overtaken European society. And it became fairly common in the 1920s and 30s to talk about what was then known as the Great War as a total war. In the 1930s, General Ludendorff published his memoirs, the memoirs were called De Totale Krieg, the total war. The converse of total war is what we often call limited war, or what German statesmen used to call cabinet wars. Those were the sorts of wars that were fought, often in the 18th century and sometimes in the 19th century. Those wars, the limited wars, had clearly defined goals, and when that goal had been achieved, the nation which was in a position to stop the war stopped it. They were often fought with professional forces, in other words, peoples who were trained to fight and did not involve great many people in society, and they were fought according to certain rules. Which of these two kinds of war, and this is another question I find fascinating, which of these two kinds of wars is actually most common and most typical of human society? And before I try and answer that question, I should say that I think war is deeply embedded in human society. As far back as we can tell, we have tended to organize ourselves into groups, and we have tended, once we are organized into groups, to use violence to achieve our ends, whether that is to defend ourselves from another group or perhaps to take over the territory or the people or the possessions of that group. So war is not random violence. War is organized violence designed to achieve the ends as defined by a particular group. Historians of war debate about whether total war or limited war is more common. John Keegan, the great British military historian, argued that early societies back in the Stone Age and later on fought limited wars, that they did not engage in mass destruction or mass killings. Anthropologists, however, of the ancient world, and more recently, archaeologists as well, have argued that there was in fact something called total war in that distant past, when societies mobilized all their resources, including sometimes women as combatants, to destroy or enslave the other. The limits came only from the weapons that were available, and in the case of hunter-forager societies, I think the ability of those being attacked to flee. We now have some evidence, thanks to modern means of checking ancient DNA and analyzing skeletons that are found. We have some evidence that in fact war was as total as people could make it in the distant past. We've found, or archaeologists have found, early mass graves with skeletons which show the signs of death from trauma caused by violence. We have seen once we began to get recorded history, examples of pre-modern wars which pitted societies against each other and involved large numbers, including civilians. Think of the Punic Wars, where Rome destroyed Carthage when it won. It destroyed the Carthaginian cities, it destroyed its agriculture. There was a legend that sprang up that Rome had salted the Carthaginian fields with salt. In fact, there's little evidence of that, but I think it gives you an idea of what happened at the end of the Punic Wars. More recently, we have seen around the world and in Europe, civil or religious wars. Think of the 17th century and the 30 Years' War, where the enemy was not just the military, but a whole people on the other side. And when in those sorts of wars, I think often civil wars and religious wars are among the worst wars you can imagine, because the enemy is not just the military fighting for that enemy. The enemy is the whole society, which is on the wrong path. And so it is permissible, if you are a devout believer in a particular religion, to kill all those on the other side, because in fact, they're standing in the way of the truth. And in a civil war, it is permissible to kill all those on the other side, because they are standing in the way of a vision of a country that you would like to see. And so I think the balance of historical evidence, if I were asked to say which I think is more likely, I would say that we have seen total war throughout history. It has been limited in some case by the ability of one side to actually inflict damage on the other side, and sometimes limited by the ability of the other side to simply withdraw. Modern total war is much more devastating, partly, of course, thanks to what has happened to modern technology, modern society, modern economies. And I want to look at it not just from the perspective of one country. I think one of the most interesting new developments in history has been to look at major international events as multinational events, and to look at them across borders, and to try and trace out commonalities as well as trace out comparisons. And so when I talk about war, total war in European society, I will be drawing from across the combatants. I'll probably use more examples from Britain and Germany, because in the 20th century, they were leading antagonists in what is still sometimes called Europe's 30 Years' War, the second 30 Years' War of the 20th century. So where does the modern total war come from, which is both like the older total wars, pitting one society against another? It's an existential struggle between two different societies, but is so much more destructive and so much more terrible. Where does modern total war come from? And I think it comes from two significant changes which took place at the end of the 18th century and took place also in the 19th century. And the first of these was that a new relationship began to develop between people who lived in a particular territory and their own government. What essentially was happening is that people were making a shift from being subjects perhaps of a king or a duke or an emperor, making a shift from being subjects to being citizens. And what that meant was they were no longer simply expected to defer to authority, and they no longer expected that they would defer to authority. What they came to expect was that they actually had a share in the government, that they had a right to choose their own governments, and that they therefore had an obligation to that government as well as an interest in that government. And that, I think, makes a very, very significant difference. We see this beginning to happen in both the American and the French revolutions, where people begin to participate in public life in a way that they might not have felt themselves entitled to participate before. And what I think we also see very early on is once people begin to conceive of themselves as citizens, they are citizens of something that is not just a territory, not just a collection of territories. They are citizens of something called the nation, that the nation begins to take on a separate existence, that it begins to be seen as something which exists above and beyond and before and after the lives of individual citizens. And so you begin to get talk of a French nation, and histories begin to be created, often, I'm afraid, rather bad histories, but nevertheless very persuasive histories begin to be created for these nations. And so people who live in France begin increasingly, and it takes time, of course, to see themselves as belonging to something called the French nation, which is different from other nations. And you get the same thing happening in Britain, where you begin to see people seeing themselves as part of a British nation, quite distinct from other nations. And you begin, of course, in the 19th century to see the idea of the development of a German nation, which has been separated into different states, but is nevertheless, in some sense, a whole. And of course, that leads to the wars of German unification, because part of the sense of being German is that there is a feeling that we should be together in a common polity. And so you're getting a very different relationship between those who live in a particular place and their governments, and a very different sense of who they are, thanks to the growth of nationalism. Very early on too, we get the idea that if you are a citizen and if you are part of a nation, then you have an obligation to that nation. You have an obligation to defend it. Let me read to you from one of the earliest statements of this, which comes in 1793 in revolutionary France. And it came at a time when the French Revolution and France itself was surrounded by enemies. It was being attacked by those who wanted to crush the revolution. And the revolutionary government issued a call for what was called a levée en masse in 1793. And I'll just read you a part because it gives you a sense of this new relationship. From this moment, said the proclamation, until the enemy is driven from the territory of the Republic, all the French people are permanently requisitioned for the armies. The young men will go to the front. Married men will forge arms and carry supplies. Women will make tents and clothing. Children will divide old linen into bandages. Old men will be carried into the squares to rouse the courage of the soldiers, to teach hatred of kings and the unity of the Republic. And so a very new concept is entered into or appears in history in the course of the late 18th century and in the course of the 19th century. And that helps to fuel the passion which makes the wars, particularly of the late 19th century and the 20th century, so deadly and so difficult to stop. But what also happens a little bit later is it becomes possible to create much bigger armies, to take advantage of this new spirit, to create bigger armies, to keep them in the field for much longer. It becomes possible also to bring the resources of society to bear on the struggle. And this, of course, is thanks to the changes brought about by the Industrial Revolution, which transforms European society and then transforms societies elsewhere around the world. It turns what had been a largely agricultural world into an increasingly urbanized one by providing new means of communications, new economic activities in the factories which the Industrial Revolution creates. It increases literacy, it increases the capacity, the productive capacity of European society. And so we get the appearance in the 19th century of increasingly urbanized societies, increasingly literate societies with communications including railways, but also the telegraph. And we get the appearance of new mass media, in particular mass newspapers. And so it becomes a vehicle for fueling and furthering this sense of nationalism. More and more people are able to read about their nation. More and more people are capable of seeing themselves part of this greater whole. And so in the course of the 19th century, you get both this new type of ideology, which brings people together and motivates them, but you also get the capacity and the means for that ideology, if it comes to it, to be worked out into war. And of course, that is going to go on through the 19th century. And increasingly other ideas begin to feed in to nationalism. I think the importance of ideas in history should never be underestimated. One of the other ideas that feeds in is social Darwinism, a misapplication of Darwinian thoughts on evolution, Darwinian theories on evolution. But what that does is argue that nations have an existence like species do in the natural world, that they are distinct one from the other, and that they are probably engaged in a struggle for survival. And the nation that doesn't survive, and this becomes increasingly moralistic in social Darwinism, probably doesn't deserve to survive because it's not prepared to fight for its existence. And so a very dangerous mix, a mix which is making great changes in Europe and also bringing, of course, great social benefits to Europeans, but there is a very dangerous mix here, which makes war on a large scale at least more likely. And of course, in the 20th century, we're going to see the continued spread of these binding and totalizing ideologies, which are going to draw on the experience of the First World War and to create mass movements which see themselves as being in a perpetual state of war. And I'm thinking of Bolshevism in its various forms, and then of course the various varieties of fascism. A number of people who watched this were concerned. They were concerned about the spread of war into something that was no longer easily controlled and easily managed. General von Moltke, the elder, who presided over the German Wars of Unification, gave a last warning to the Reichstag in 1890. He said, the wars of the past, the limited wars, or what he called the cabinet wars, have gone, and all we have now is people's war. And any prudent government will hesitate to bring out a war of this nature with all its incalculable consequences. And then he said, gentlemen, it may be a war of 7 years or of 30 years duration, and woe to him who sets Europe alight, who puts the first fuse to powder keg. And unfortunately, that was going to happen. And there were warnings before the First World War of what was changing in war. The American Civil War, for example, gave a sense of what happens when you get peoples moving against each other. And you begin to get a sense that civilians are often becoming as ferocious as the soldiers themselves. And there were, at the same time, because nothing is ever straightforward, I think, in history, attempts to impose limits on the new types of war that were clearly coming along. Geneva and Hague conventions about the treatment of prisoners of war and civilians. Two big Hague conferences in 1899 and 1907 in an attempt to try and find alternatives to war through arbitration, for example, and attempts to limit war. And there was also the growth of a huge international public opinion which supported these efforts and was opposed to war. And so another interesting question, why did these attempts to limit war, why did these attempts to push Europe off the path, which was a dangerous path of growing militarism and growing antagonism among nations, why did those attempts fail? And they failed, I think, partly because of nationalism. In 1914, when the First World War broke out, the Second International, the Working Class International, which had said, members on all sides, French members, German members, Italian members, British members, they'd all said they'd go on strike if a war was declared because it wouldn't be a war for them. When war was declared, in fact, they all fell apart on national lines. The biggest social democratic party, the biggest socialist party in Europe, the German Social Democratic Party, voted for war credits in the Reichstag as the war broke out. Governments were also successful in portraying the war as something that was defensive and just. I am not sure that anyone, or very few people who went into the First World War, particularly those in authority, really understood what it was going to be like. The war itself took over, and this so often happens in wars. Easy to start, and then they take on, as von Clausewitz said, their own logic, and they can be very difficult to stop. And the First World War, the Great War, of course, as it was known until the second one broke out, turned into a total war very, very early on. Both sides were appalled at how quickly their supplies ran out. The Germans used more munitions in every day in the First Battle of the Marne in September 1914 than in the whole 10 months of the Franco-Prussian War, when there was fighting between the French and the German armies. They began to realize that they had stumbled into something that was going to turn into a stalemate. One of the great tragedies of the First World War was that the powers were so evenly balanced in Europe that it was very hard for one or the other side to win. And of course, the productive capacity and the mobilization capacity of Europe was so great that it was possible to keep those armies in the field fighting for a very, very long time indeed. And so as the war settled into stalemate, the powers began to realize that they had to adjust to it. And suddenly another part of the war effort became very important. And another word was coined, another phrase was coined, and that was the home front. It had been thought in the past the war front was what was mattered. People went off to fight. The soldiers decided, or the navies decided what would happen. Now the home front, those working at home to support the war effort, became as much part of the war effort. And they also, of course, became as much part of the target. Once you begin to see war as something that is engaging societies, and once the First World War settles into this dreadful stalemate, then you get people on both sides beginning to see the other side as a whole, a totality, an organic whole. And it therefore becomes permissible to attack not just the combatants on the other side, it becomes permissible to attack those who are supporting those combatants. And so we see in the First World War, and it was going to happen again in the Second World War, and it's what I think why it deservedly is called total, the line between those who are fighting and the civilians is almost totally erased because the civilians are supporting those who are fighting, and so they become legitimate targets. They tried as much as they could, both sides, to attack the other side, to attack the civilians on the other side. In the First World War, their options were more limited than they were in the Second World War because the technology had not yet developed. But where they could, they used weapons to attack civilians on the other side. The German fleet shelled British ports. German Zeppelins flew over cities like London, dropping bombs, not in those days doing very much damage, but you can see the blurring of the lines between those who are fighting and the civilians taking place. or cities were shelled with long-range artillery, and the targets couldn't be chosen with any discrimination, and part of the intention was to attack those on the other side. Both also used propaganda to weaken the morale on the other side. The Allies dropped leaflets over Vienna, for example, or leaflets as much as they could over German cities. And the Germans and the Central Powers as a whole did their best to stir up trouble for the Allied powers, sponsoring and trying to fuel, for example, the jihad among the Muslims in the British and the French empires. And so war begins to overflow its boundaries in many and dreadful ways. It also overflows its boundaries in the territories that are occupied. And there were, before the war started, very firm rules about what was permissible and what wasn't permissible in occupied territories. And those began to be breached, mostly, but not entirely, by the Central Powers, because the Central Powers were in occupation of more territory than the French or the British or the Russians were. But where the Russians did occupy territory, Austrian territory, they did not treat the locals well. We used to think that the stories of atrocities committed by German forces in Belgium, in occupied Belgium, 90% of Belgium was occupied. We used to think those atrocities were mostly made up by British propaganda, and very successful propaganda at that. But recent research has shown that, in fact, the Germans occupying forces did often break the rules of law. They carried out reprisals. If they ran into trouble, they would pick out, say, 10 citizens at random and shoot them. And they stripped Belgium of its goods. They made it very difficult for the Belgians to carry on. And they also took large numbers of Belgians as forced labor into Germany. And this was against the previous understandings on war. The Austrians, when they occupied Serbia, behaved in similar ways. And so you can see the breakdown as this war drags on. What is also happening at home in the powers that are fighting is they are beginning to have to make changes to their own societies in the ways in which they manage their own societies. The reality of war forced adaptation on every power that was engaged in it. One of the signs of what was changing was that there was increasing government control over economies and societies. Manpower became something that governments took an intense interest, and Britain, which had not had conscription before, found itself obliged to introduce it. Other countries already had conscription. Huge numbers of men were mobilized, some volunteers, but a lot conscripted. It's been estimated 66 million men had been mobilized by the end of the First World War. But those living at home who were not going to the fronts also found their lives increasingly under government control. Those in particular jobs in most countries that were deemed essential for the war effort could not change them without government permission. Patterns of consumption were changed. Even diversions were changed. The British banned flying of kites, for example, under the Defence of the Realm Act. It's never clear why it should happen. But I think you get a sense that governments are struggling to cope with the enormous demands of the war, the huge drain of resources, both in terms of manpower, but also in the equipment, the food, everything needed to keep that manpower in the field and able to fight. And so governments found themselves engaging in economies in ways which would have been unimaginable in peacetime. Governments found themselves fixing prices. They found themselves requisitioning supplies. Germany moved very early, the earliest of all the great powers, to create a special bureau. It's called, in English, the Raw Materials section of the Prussian War Ministry, which acquired and distributed essential raw materials. Governments also began to take increasing shares of the national wealth. Between 1913 and 1918, in France and Germany, the government share of GDP, of gross domestic product, rose from 10% in 1913 to 50 to 53% by the end of the war. In Britain, it rose from 8 to 35%, still an enormous increase. And so you see a change in the ways in which societies mobilize themselves, which is forced on them by the demands of the war. In Germany, in fact, by 1916, the government was effectively a military dictatorship. As the war dragged on, other forms of warfare became increasingly important as well. Economic war, both sides tried to destroy or deny resources to enemy economies. We all know about both the German U-boat war and the British blockade, two of the most significant types of economic warfare. The German campaign at sea had never been conceived as a submarine campaign. The Germans had built a very large high seas fleet, which they had assumed would go out and fight the British high seas fleet. Submarines were a neglected and rather despised part of the German fleet until they proved their worth. And what submarines did in the early stages of the war is begin to attack shipping, carrying essential war supplies to the British Isles and to France. And it took until 1916, and in fact, the end of 1916 and into 1917, for the British to find ways of countering this. And in its most successful phases, the German U-boat war came very close to seriously damaging the British war effort. And the British had, for their part, a blockade of both German shipping and neutral shipping going into German ports. And this was very deliberately an attempt to starve German war industries. Very, very controversial subject, and I'll return to it in a moment. You also had an attempt to, a number of attempts were made to keep up a morale on your own side, just as they were trying to undermine morale on the other side. Governments were also trying to keep up morale on their own side. And so they used the media. The new media of film now began for the first time to become important and be used in both propaganda efforts on both sides. Both sides used censorship. The British authorities did not allow war artists or photographers to portray corpses on the front. They were taken up to the Western Front, but they were not allowed to show any dead bodies. And this was going to cause considerable tension, in fact, with war artists. Some of the propaganda was very effective. The British made a film of the Battle of the Somme, which something like a quarter of all the adult population in Britain saw in the first summer that it was out in 1916. And although they didn't show the full disaster of the Battle of the Somme, what they did show was what trench warfare was like. Most of the shots, in fact, were created elsewhere in Hyde Park, but there were some actual shots from the front. And audiences were horrified, moved, a tremendous amount of emotion as they saw it. Germany was less successful in its propaganda, although it was going to learn a great deal from the British propaganda of the First World War, and its propaganda in the Second World War was infinitely more successful. But in the First World War, the Germans tended to make films which showed contented soldiers sitting at the front, reading their post, having their meals, sometimes volunteering to rebuild churches that might have been hurt by shelling. Apparently, when soldiers were actually shown such movies, they simply broke out laughing because they bore so little resemblance to what they were actually doing. And so the war forced upon societies ways of trying to manage their own societies, ways of trying to undermine the other society, which perhaps none of them had expected before the war started. What also happened is, as the war went on, what was permissible began to be expanded, or the old rules began to break down. They were already breaking down when it came to treating occupied territories, but they began to break down also when it came to the sorts of weapons that were being used. Under the pressure of the war, there was a tremendous search, understandably, to try and find ways of breaking the deadlock. And so both sides began to harness their own industry, their own science and technology to try and come up with new and more effective weapons, some of which, of course, turned out to be very effective indeed, including the tank. The Germans got a great deal of international criticism for breaching what had been a rule when they first used gas. They used gas in 1815, although they had signed up to a Hague Convention in 1899, in which, and I'll read it to you, the contracting parties agree to abstain from the use of projectiles, the sole object of which is the diffusion of asphyxiating or deleterious gases. And this did not help the Germans internationally. And the German argument was that they weren't actually breaching the Geneva Convention because they weren't using projectiles, they were using canisters. But it wasn't, I think, a very convincing argument. But I think it's a sign of how both sides actually were prepared to break previous rules of war because they were becoming increasingly desperate about the costs that the wars were taking. At any rate, as we know, in the end, these Central Powers lost. They weren't able to sustain the war, and they lost partly because they didn't have the resources to match the Allied resources. In the end, I think the German position was basically a weak one in any long war. And that, of course, is why the German plans had been for very quick and sudden victories. The basic problem with the German position is that when it attacked the Russians and when it went to war with Britain, it was attacking two of its main suppliers of foodstuffs. Something like a quarter of all the wheat imports to Germany before the First World War had come from Russia. Almost all the vegetable fats and oils, which were an important part of the German diet and also important in German industry, came from the British and French empires. And so by going to war with its greatest suppliers, as many historians have pointed out, the Germans put themselves in an impossible, or at least very difficult position when it came to a long war. The British blockade during the war itself added further pressure on Germany because it prevented neutrals from carrying supplies to Germany or made it much more difficult. And there is, as you know, a great deal of controversy over this. Controversy also over the continuation of the blockade after the war. And it's been seen, I think, often by historians as something close to a war crime. More recent research has painted, I think, a more complex picture and also pointed to failures in Germany itself to manage distribution. The government also very early on set maximum prices for agricultural products, which had the effect of discouraging farmers from producing. It has been argued, and I leave simply the argument open, that if the German government had managed its food supplies more efficiently, Germany could have managed and German civilians would have suffered less. Well, I'm not going to go into the same amount of detail in the Second World War because in many ways, it continues to develop what has happened in the First World War. What makes the Second World War, however, even more total and more global is that the technology has changed so much. There are no longer any static fronts, and the difference, if there ever was one between the home and the war fronts, almost totally vanished. And this, of course, is because of the new types of weapons, longer range bombers, which can now hit the enemy cities from a long distance, aircraft carriers, which can carry air war to the enemy territories, a mechanized war on land where troops and armed forces can cover vast distances very quickly. The advances in the Second World War in the science and technology, of course, are enormous. And I think perhaps a symbol of that is the atomic bomb with which the war in the East ends, the two bombs that are dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. What also happens in the Second World War is also what we saw happening in the First World War, an increasing radicalization of war aims, one society against another whole society, the civilians being seen as absolutely legitimate targets. The mass bombing of the Second World War makes that very clear indeed. What also comes into the Second World War, even more than in the First World War, of course, is the racial component, particularly in the center of Europe and in the Far East, which means that any restraints that there might have been on those fighting simply dissolve because they are fighting those who are seen as inferiors, whose deaths on a large scale, in fact, might be desirable because they shouldn't be on the earth in any case. What happened, I won't go into it, but you all know what happened in Central Europe, both the Holocaust, but also the killing of prisoners of war, the mass labor, which was starvation of forced labor from Russia and elsewhere, the horrors of the Japanese prisoner of war camps, the cruelties of occupations in China, Ukraine, Poland, the Baltic states, marked by sheer number of atrocities and of hideous exploitation. These are things which were foreshadowed in the First World War, but become both much more possible in the Second World War because of the technology, but also because of the racial element. So where are we today? Do we still have those components in our society? And I would argue that in some societies, we have seen a very significant shift. After 1946, I think, Europeans changed in their attitudes towards war. The two total wars, First and Second World Wars, are no longer seen as glorious, no longer seen as having a point. Increasingly, they're seen as wars that shouldn't have happened, that caused huge amounts of destruction and devastation, huge amounts of death, and simply serve no purpose. I think if you look at most European societies, they are not militaristic. They do not value the military values. They do not see themselves as engaged in an existential struggle against other societies. increasingly, I think societies around the world are not prepared to accept the sort of casualties which were once accepted in the First and Second World Wars. Hugh Strachan, the great British military historian, has said about Vietnam, after Vietnam, both the public and politicians were re-educated to expect wars to be short, victorious, and comparatively bloodless. And I think that is true, certainly, of a lot of countries in the world today, perhaps not all. And that is something we always have to be concerned about. But the British, the Americans, my own people, the Canadians, take it very hard when even 1 or 2 soldiers are killed in a far-off war. And any casualty, I think, is seen as any too much. And I think we've become increasingly unwilling to accept collateral, as it in the awful term, damage to civilians. And we've become increasingly concerned that we should actually have rules of engagement. And so it may be that we no longer will see total war in the way that we saw it in earlier periods. But the capacity, we should always remember, is there. We've done it before. We've done it through a lot of our history. Let's just hope we don't do it again. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Margaret, for that extraordinary tour de force. To those of you in our audience who haven't yet read Professor MacMillan's latest book, I hope will be back on sale shortly in physical form and can be purchased as a Kindle document straight away. And the book expands on a number of the points that Professor MacMillan has just made. Perhaps, and please, as I said at the beginning, do send in your questions through the chat function. I wonder if I could begin with a question going back to the definitions of total war that you started with. In Germany in the 20th century, perhaps the most famous use of the term total war was in the speech by Goebbels in February 1943 in the Sportspalast, when he continually said to his audience, "Wollen Sie den totalen Krieg? Do you want total war?" And I think what was remarkable was that at that stage in the war, there had already been the deliberate attempt to characterize the war in the East as a war of destruction, not as a limited war. It was also more than a year after the Wannsee conference when the final touch paper had been lit to the mass murder of European Jewry, and the extent to which forced labor was of civilians of other countries were being used in Germany had already got underway. So I think in Goebbels' view, the distinction between total war and non-total war was actually the effect on his own German population, that after that speech, it became impossible to evade conscription. The executions of people for defeatism were significantly increased. And I wonder if that is something which is reflected in other people's use of the term as well, that it is more about the society of the belligerent rather than the effect on the opponents.
It's an interesting question, and I think it gives a sense of the complexity of the whole notion of total war. And I was reading quite an interesting book the other day, edited by Stig Foster, and I'm trying to remember who else, on total war. And they held 3 conferences in which they tried to decide what total war meant. And they couldn't come up with a clear definition. And I tend to see it as something which, yes, involves the resources, the sinews, however they used to put it in speeches, of society. But it's also total in its ambitions, that it sees itself as engaged in an existential struggle for existence, and that it sees the other side as something that has to be subjugated, if necessary, got rid of. So I would see it both as something that is domestic and also something that is open-ended or total in its goals. And I think that the Goebbels speech is very interesting because, of course, the promise had been guns and butter, that Germans would not suffer from the war, that they would enjoy it. And initially, most, except for those who were fighting, a lot of Germans had benefited from the war. The huge amounts of foodstuffs that were taken from France and the Netherlands and Belgium, for example, did in fact improve the German standard of living for a while. But what he is doing at this point, I think, is mobilizing them through propaganda. And in a way, of course, the Nazi Party is a party on a war footing anyway. It's a party organized around an enemy, a party which demands total allegiance. And so it in a sense, even in peacetime, it is preparing or thinking or considering war.
Thank you very much. A question from Oliver Waugh, in that making the point that in the UK, after both the First and Second World Wars, there was a change in the social contract. So after the First World War, you had an extension of the votes for women. After the Second World War, you had the introduction of the National Health Service. To what extent do you see this as a consequence of war, and to what extent were those developments mirrored in continental countries?
I think war can bring unintended consequences which can be good. And this is not to in any way defend war, but I think that the increased participation by citizens in war makes government recognize that they have to do something for them. And even in preparations for war, I mean, a lot of the improvements in public health and education in European countries before the First World War were driven by the need to create people who'd be more able to go to war, to create people who could read and write and were more the type of more educated soldiers and sailors that they needed. But I think certainly in Britain and elsewhere after the First World War and after the Second World War again, there was a sense that an awful lot had been demanded of the ordinary citizens, and they had by and large risen to it, and they did owe something to them. I mean, I think the fact that women, only over the age 30 initially, but nevertheless, women got the vote and labor, working class men got the vote, even before the First World War had ended in Britain, was a recognition of their participation in war. And those who created the welfare state, which of course encompassed the national health, perhaps its key component, but other elements as well. Those who created the welfare state during the Second World War, people like Sir William Beveridge talked very consciously about the need to create a different sort of society, that you could not go on in the old way, ignoring those who did contribute to society. So, and it wasn't just in Britain. I mean, all over Europe after the Second World War, you've got social democratic governments elected, often on the promise that they were going to build a different sort of society, and they did so.
I'd like to pick up on a question by Martin Bond and slightly expand it. In your book, you make the very interesting point that Alfred Nobel, before he set up his Peace Prize, had been thinking of trying to create a weapon of total destruction, which was so awful that no one would want to use it, and therefore would create an end to war. And Martin's question is, to what extent has deterrence since the Second World War and the use of the atomic bombs actually been effective, or have we just been lucky that there hasn't been a total war since the end of the two world wars?
I'd be inclined to say both, actually. I think the nuclear deterrent, particularly when it was a monopoly or virtual monopoly of the two superpowers, was in fact a very effective deterrent to war. And both sides recognized, particularly by the 60s, as the means of delivery got better and as the nuclear arsenals grew, that if they launched a war on the other side would still retain a second strike capacity, which would devastate the country that started the war. And so in that wonderful acronym MAD, Mutually Assured Destruction, it did keep the peace. But I think we were also very lucky, because I think there were moments in the Cuban Missile Crisis, for example, or in the aftermath of the shooting down of KAL-007 in 1983, and even on other occasions where people misread signals. I think there were times when we came awfully close to one side or the other launching.
A question from Peter Watkins, picking up on the new types of war that are being practiced around disinformation, cyber attacks, using the internet as a weapon of war, and to what extent these grey zone or hybrid conflicts are actually a modern type of total war, or would you say that there's something else entirely?
I'm having trouble with this, not with the question, but with the whole concept, because I tend to define war as an act of organized violence, in Clausewitz's terms, designed to compel your enemy to do your will. And I think if we open it up and use the analogy too widely, then the war itself loses meaning. On the other hand, I think there are auxiliaries to war, like the propaganda wars that were fought in the First and Second World Wars, which are part of a war effort, but I would see them as auxiliaries. And I suppose disinformation in the absence of armed conflict is an attempt to cause problems for the other side or someone you see as an enemy, but is not yet an act of war. Cyber war is trickier because cyber war, it seems to me, has the potential to cause real damage and suffering to civilian populations and to seriously impede the war-making capacity of the other side. And so cyber war, I would see as something that is more a direct act of war. But on all the edges of this, there are always the gray areas. And so I'm afraid I'm giving a rather fuzzy answer too.
As we're the British-German Association, we encourage you to focus your talk on Britain and Germany, but we've had a number of questions about other parts of the world. One from Ernesto Correa about Latin America, and one from Hanno Baltz about the US or China. Can you say, are there examples of total war, in your opinion, in those areas since World War II, when there was clearly a total war in the Far East?
In Latin America is very interesting because Latin America's had no major war between states for a very long time, actually. I mean, there was a football war in Central America, but I think that isn't, seen by most people as a major war. What it seems to have had much more is civil wars and internal armed violence. And that is something which, perhaps has spared Latin America some of the worst horrors of state-to-state war. But nevertheless, they have seen a level of violence which continues in certain countries to this day. Why that should be so, I'm not sure. And I think it's actually a very interesting question that should be further explored. The other question about Asia, I would argue that the war in Korea came close to a total war, and certainly in its impact on the two Koreas, which were, the cities by and large absolutely devastated. And the struggle, certainly on the Chinese side, was seen as again, an existential struggle against capitalist powers. So in Asia, I think, has seen perhaps wars that come close to that. The one I would see as probably being closest to a total war since 1945 is the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s, which, we tend not to pay much attention to. But if you look at the numbers who were killed, I think the total killed, and these things are always difficult to estimate, is something like 750,000. And this was seen as a war of, it was a religious war. It was seen as a war of one type of religion against another type of religion, although both from the same overarching religion. But there was also a racial element. I think there was an element of Persian against Arab in it as well. So I would say it came closer to a total war than perhaps some of the others.
Thank you. A question from Andrew Gilchrist about the drivers of total war. Based on what you were saying about the archaeological and anthropological evidence, total war can exist in very primitive forms of society with very primitive weapons, although clearly the scale of destruction is much greater with modern weapons and modern societies. But is there, in your view, a defining set of factors that gives rise to a total war between countries?
I'm wondering if it is, and of course we don't know enough about the motivation of people before written records, but I'm wondering if it is something to do with highly cohesive societies in odd ways, societies whose members feel themselves to be part of a greater whole, who feel themselves, in that phrase of Benedict Anderson's, to be part of imagined communities, which has a very powerful effect on how you define yourself. And if you feel yourself to be part either of a community where you know all the members in a small clan or tribe, you can do that. But if you feel yourself to be part of a community, even if it's something you can never see or you'll never meet most of its members, the threat of another community perhaps seems the greater. And your willingness to fight for that, your own community against the other community, perhaps becomes stronger. I mean, I'm just speculating, but it may be an unfortunate consequence of societies in which there is a high degree of cohesion and people feeling part of a community. The threat, therefore, may seem the greater, and the willingness to take up violence against the threat may be greater.
One of the most interesting themes I found in your book was the space you devoted to the role of women in war, not just as victims of war, but in some societies as participants as well. And we have a question from Richard Jaggard about, do you believe that if we had a world run by women, that it would be a less dangerous place than in a primarily male-run world?
Well, I'm a woman, but I don't feel any obligation to defend my own sex. I think if you look at some of the most successful leaders who have made wars recently, well, you can start with Catherine the Great, Maria Theresa, Queen Elizabeth I, Golda Meir, Indira Gandhi, Margaret Thatcher. I mean, women in positions of power don't necessarily stop wars. In fact, sometimes they start them or they carry them on. And I think there's enough evidence that women in the past have been what I would call cheerleaders for war. They have encouraged the men to go and fight. I mean, you think of the women who went around in the First World War with white feathers, telling men they were cowards if they didn't fight. So the idea, I think, that we are naturally kinder and more pacific, I'm not sure is borne out really by the evidence.
A question from Fiona Franks about the armaments industry and to what extent they play the chicken or the egg in terms of war. And just to put that in more concrete terms, what is noticeable is that up until the end of the Second World War, fighting competent countries tended to use all the means at their disposal, with the perhaps exception of the very limited use of gas in the Second World War. But since then, since Hiroshima, there's been no deployment of nuclear weapons. So is the armaments industry something that creates war by providing the weapons for it, or is it just a reflection of the demand for weapons between warring states?
I would say probably the second, but I would also say that when there are lots of arms around, violence, using them is more likely. Civil wars, I think, become more likely when you have a lot of people with weapons. And I know that George Bernard Shaw in Major Barbara argued that it was the arms manufacturers who created the First World War. And then there was the American Congress, the Senate held the Nye Commission in the 1930s, which came to the same conclusion. And there were a number of books written in the 1920s and 30s arguing this. My own view is that arms manufacturers don't necessarily want wars. In fact, sometimes they'd rather not have them because they can sell arms to both sides. Krupp was selling defenses to the Belgians in their big forts in their big forts along the frontiers, at the same time as it was making the guns that the German army was going to use to knock them down. And so, in fact, for arms manufacturers, a tense peace can often be quite good because you can sell your weapons widely. The danger, I think, is more when governments and military have weapons which are becoming obsolete. And then the pressure is to use them before they do so, before they do become obsolete. I mean, the arms race, I think, is perhaps more dangerous than the existence of armaments themselves. That tremendous pressure that if we don't use them now, they won't be any use in 2 years. I may be wrong, though, but I think it's governments more who drive wars.
Yeah. One last question, I'm afraid, which is all we have time for, from Violetta Gaglioni about the aftermath of total war. Do you feel that, particularly in the context of the Anglo-German relationship, that was worsened and made more difficult to repair after the Second World War because of the extent to which civilians were targeted?
Funnily enough, I don't think it did. I think the attitude, and it was there after the First World War as well, and it was certainly there after the Second World War, is that we've all suffered a catastrophe, that this is something that has hurt Europe as a whole, and it's hurt people on all sides of all borders. And I think in a way, a great catastrophe can sober you up. That's not the right word, but can make you think and reflect about what you've just done and about how you might do things better. And who would have predicted that not just Britain and Germany, but Britain and France would be working together so closely and even capable of commemorating the past together. And I find this, you know, very encouraging indeed. And so I think wars can leave lasting bitterness, but sometimes wars can simply represent a break with the past. And I think we see a very different, well, of course, a very different Germany now, a very different Europe. You know, it isn't a Europe which has those ghosts or those currents that haunted it in the past. The social Darwinism has pretty much gone. The militarism is gone. The hyper-nationalism, I mean, it still exists here and there, but I think it's not what it was before 1914 or after 1918. And for that, I think we should all be very thankful.
Thank you very much. I'd like to invite my colleague Antony to propose a vote of thanks.
Yes, thank you very much to Professor MacMillan for her fascinating and incredibly thought-provoking lecture, and to the German Historical Institute London for co-hosting this event with us, and of course to everyone in the audience for sending in such interesting questions. As Dr. Scheich mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, and as Peter also said, Professor MacMillan's book is available now in stores, on Waterstones, online as well. I think it is actually still in stock on Waterstones, on the Waterstones website. And to those of you who are new to the BGA, we hope you enjoyed this evening's talk and would like to encourage you to become BGA members if you did. We have some great upcoming events in November, including a discussion on the UK's and Germany's comparative responses to COVID, and a talk by author Thomas Harding. Information about these two events will be released closer to the time, so please stay tuned. And you can also catch up on some of the events that you may have missed in the past couple of weeks on our website. So you can catch up under the past events tab, if you like. And without further ado, I'd like to thank you again for joining us tonight. Thank you for Professor MacMillan for her talk, and I wish you all a very good evening.
Thank you very much indeed.